There's absolutely no disorder. The month of March was quite telling because it was the first several weeks of the war, and that's when we were collecting our data live. And what we see is that the Chinese economy actually had a pretty positive month, especially because they were coming back from the Lunar New Year holidays. I completely agree with Zoe, who's a friend, that of course China certainly does not want to see any disorder in the Middle East. But I also want to point out that if anybody's best situated to deal with what's happening, at least in the short term, it's them.
Just remind us, where does China get its oil and gas and all that energy stuff?
It is a combination. As far as Iran is concerned, they buy a ton from Russia too, by the way.
Yep.
And of course, 90% of Iranian oil was bought up by the Chinese. So that is important for them. But I think it makes up, probably between 15 to 20% max, I think, of their inputs, if that.
Do they have their own energy? China, oil production is not that big for them. But they of course refine a lot of oil, and they also export oil, which is what right now they're trying to. They've technically speaking put some restrictions in place because they're saying we got to conserve the oil for the domestic market.
Do we have 4 or is it 5 stories going on at once?
Oh, geez.
I think it's out to 5.
Yeah.
Important headlines moments ago. We'll get back to China here in a second. With the first headline, Trump arrives at Supreme Court for birthright citizenship case. We'll go to Tyler Kendall here. I'm guessing in 6 minutes off the top of my head. Immediately, Iran. Strait won't reopen based on Trump's, quote, absurd, unquote, displays. That from our T-Live team on translation. Strait won't reopen. The market was up 300 some points, gives up 100 points in a heartbeat, up 194 points right now. Paul Sweeney here to continue our discussion of China.
So, Shehzad, just give us maybe kind of the 30,000 foot view of how you guys view the Chinese economy today, and kind of what are some of the key points we need to focus on?
I think the first key point is that the Chinese industrial sector remains very, very strong. Okay. We saw evidence of that certainly in the month of March, and I think we're going to get more of that. With the Supreme Court having kicked out IEEPA tariffs, there's actually this room in which we're seeing front loading happening. We're seeing orders from the U.S. jump, right? So strong sign there.
Really?
Absolutely. The second interesting thing is there's this whole trend right now of a commodities crunch, including, of course, concerns around aluminum supply crunch. What we saw in our commodities data is Chinese factories actually pulling back on production. So if you're talking about a global shortage potentially occurring, including within aluminum, we'd want to see more Chinese production, and Chinese production certainly accelerate. That's something we're going to be watching. But copper, steel, they certainly pull back on, even if they didn't pull back substantially on the aluminum part. Those are, I think, the industrial side remains very, very important. So I want to stick with that.
But how about the real estate part of the equation for the average Chinese consumer? That's been obviously a big headwind. Characterize where we are on that right now.
Real estate is no longer a drag on the economy. And so whereas it's not going to go back to what it used to look like by any stretch of the imagination, there has been these pockets of recoveries, I should say, that we've seen around the country, and some good news. It's just not a stable picture of good news month after month or quarter after quarter, but it's certainly not a picture of continuous, deep, worsening pain.
Presumably, it's still on the schedule for President Xi and President Trump to meet, I think, next month. It sounds like President Xi can say, my economy's doing just fine here. How do you think, what are your expectations at the China Beige Book for what those talks could lead to potentially?
We need to keep, I think, our expectations quite limited in this particular instance, putting aside the president, who can be a bit of a wild card. The way this has been structured by the interagency process, to the extent we have one right now, and their counterparts in China, is to keep this very, very limited. We'd like to see some big purchase announcements out of the Chinese and so forth, but this is not a traditional trip. The U.S. government and a big entourage of CEOs are not walking in there looking for greater market access in China and big reforms in China.
You are expert on this, a delicate question, the state, the relationship of Beijing, of Xi with the military. What an uproar over the last 90 days.
Yeah, I mean, we thought he was cleaning house, and then he went some more. And where it, I think, has the biggest implications probably is on people's Taiwan timeline. Everybody thinks 2027 is this
What's your Taiwan timeline?
I am not convinced that they make a play on Taiwan in the next several years. I think that gets I think it's played up a lot more than it should be.
Interesting.
quickly. Why?
Yeah.
They're not prepared to do it. I'm not sure they need to necessarily do it. There's nothing that's pushing Xi to just get it done.